Ontario's 2022 budget was dubbed by the government as a plan for better jobs and bigger paychecks. And given that it's effectively the PC's election platform, it's probably fair to say that it reflects a widespread sense that economic issues, from kitchen tables to gas pumps, for example, will motivate more than a few voters. With us now on what's on offer and whether the campaign trail is even a good place to talk about economic policy, let's introduce our guests, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Lethbridge, Alberta, with Ken Bosenkool, Senior Fellow at the Smart Prosperity Institute and a Research Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. In Montreal, Quebec, Alison Christians, Professor and Chair of Tax Law at McGill University and co-author of Tax Cooperation in an Unjust World. And in the nation's capital, there's Armine Yalnizyan, economist and Atkinson Fellow on the future of workers, and we're delighted to have you three back with us here on TVO tonight. Alison, do you still love tax law? I'm just checking. I'm just checking.
You know I do.
There you go. Okay, we have the proof. We know you still love tax law. We are going to put a few of the parties' promises under the sort of expert's microscope, if I can call it that, tonight. And we'll get each of you to weigh in on what you believe makes economic sense and perhaps what doesn't. And let's start with what I think has captured a great deal of attention during this election campaign, and that is the Liberals' so-called Buck-a-Ride province-wide plan, where they would essentially subsidize to the tune of $700 million the first year and more than $1 billion in the second year the cost of riding the rails or the buses or the streetcars or whatever, wherever you live in this province. Let's go through this. Armine, what do you think?
Oh, I think it's a genius plan because it's directly taking on Buck-a-Beer, which lasted all of a few weeks, and I think only one brand put it out. So a Buck-a-Ride is actually transformational as a form of public infrastructure that will literally put money in the pockets of the people that need it most and deal with our problems with climate change and carbon emissions and increase the demand for better public transit. And it also rivals the highway plan of the incumbent government. So in every way, it is a real alternative to what's on the menu if we kept on with this government.
Alison, Buck-a-Ride province-wide, what do you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to disagree. I think it's not a great idea. I totally get that the heart is in the right place or maybe near the right place, but you have to means test things like these because you're building an infrastructure that has to be paid for. And if you give a Buck-a-Ride, that's a Buck-a-Ride if you're a multimillionaire living in a mini mansion and if you're somebody living on minimum wage. That doesn't make fiscal sense to me.
Ken, let me get you in, and then we're going to go over a second round on this because I want to hear what Armine has to say about Alison's opinion. Go ahead, Ken.
Well, the interesting thing about voting in Canada is increasingly the richer you are, the more likely you are to vote Liberal. And the Liberals in their press release on this said that this was for people living in Oakville going to the Jays game. And so they're targeting rich people and subsidizing rich people taking transit. Now, you know, as Alison just said, if you really want to help poor people take transit, then subsidize poor people's transit. Don't give $100 a ride to anyone that's out there. And so the Liberals are just targeting their swing voters, which are rich people in Oakville, and trying to win the election by doing that. But I think it's bad public policy.
Although, Ken, I mean, you're a guy who's been involved in many election platforms in the past. You'll have to admit that Buck-a-Ride province-wide sounds better than Buck-a-Ride as long as your income isn't too high and you're eligible for it and low enough income, right?
That, you know, look, elections are about sending signals about the kind of priorities that you have to the general population, and you have to do it in a way that is catchy, and you can't put if you're explaining you're losing. And so, sure, that it has a nice jingle to it. That doesn't mean that doesn't make it good public policy. You can have a good jingle and have good public policy, but this is neither of those things, or one of those things.
Okay, Armine, you want to come back on any of this?
Oh, you bet. So, you know, we're talking about a government that is in power that wishes to spend $25 billion on highways. And that also advances the economic interests of those with more money than less money. This actually spends more money on the poorest, the people that don't have cars, the people that need to rely on public transit, the people that are looking for work that are long-term unemployed, the disabled, people on social assistance, the unemployed, students. Everybody gets to discover their city, discover Ontario and where you live in your own community. Where it fails is the group of people that don't live in urban centers with good transit. That is its only failure. Because in my view, to encourage people to take public transit is a social good. And you want to encourage rich people to take it too and not just stick in their cars. Plus, if you don't have a car, it's good public policy. If you do have a car, it's good public policy because it's going to take people off the road. So win, win, win.
All right, having said that, Alison, is there any evidence that we know of that suggests that if you offer this kind of inducement to people, they actually will do what the hope is behind this thing, namely either leave the car at home or help more people take transit? Will it actually do that?
Well, I think it might help people leave the car in the parking lot where they jump on the train. I'm not really sure exactly who isn't taking transit because it's too costly now. So that's part of the picture. But look, I totally agree that this is it's much better to build the infrastructure around public transit than what the Conservative Party has on offer, which is to build more roads. Both of those plans seem to go in opposite directions. So what are we really trying to do here? We're trying to build ways to move people around that doesn't cause or contribute to climate disaster. So in that way, the policy wins, but it has to be paid for. And that is, I think, the thing that worries me when politicians talk about giving across the board breaks to people regardless of their ability to pay. It really interferes with that idea that the tax system, first and foremost, it should be fair. And this isn't.
Well, let me do one follow-up on this, one last follow-up with Ken, and that is, this is a 2-year plan at the moment. As I say, $700 million the first year, more than $1 billion the second year. What happens the third year? I mean, can you imagine if you've been riding, let's say, the Toronto Transit Commission subway for 2 years at $1 a ride? There's no indication at the moment whether the fares go back to what they used to be in year 3. Is that a problem in terms of how you craft this thing?
Yeah, perhaps. I think the problem with transit is that there's not enough of it going to places where people want to use it. And so instead of spending money for 2 years and having a question mark at the end, what they should have done is more long-term planning to build transit. Instead of subsidizing riders, they should have subsidized the building of transit and then give low-income people maybe a bit more cash to be able to afford it. So I think it's just wrong for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't help in the planning of infrastructure. It doesn't of transit. And so transit, the problem with transit is there's not enough of it going where we need it, and building more of it and not subsidizing ridership is a better way to go.
Okay. Item 2, the NDP came out with a Dentacare plan. And the leader, Andrea Horwath, said we have OHIP, we have Medicare, basically for problems that take place anywhere else in our body. Why would a problem you have inside your mouth somehow be exempt? And when you put it that way, that's a pretty fair argument. Alison, what's your view on a publicly funded Dentacare plan?
Yeah, okay. So you just have to think about what it is that you think should be in the public sector versus in the private sector. So when you say a dental care plan, are you talking about preventative care, cavities, and solving problems before they arise? That sounds like healthcare to me. But are you talking about teeth straightening and whitening, or surgery to change the shape of your jaw or something? Maybe it's not quite as easy to just say the dental care should be public. In the same way, you have to think about, what social goal are you trying to achieve? And if the social goal is get everybody up to a certain level of dental health, I think that's something that I'm not sure why we wouldn't get behind. That seems like a good idea to me.
Well, let's go back to the income testing issue. And Armine, right now, the way the NDP have structured it, you could make $90,000 a year and be eligible for this Dentacare program, rising at a certain point to $200,000 of annual income and still be eligible for this. So let's get back to the income tested thing. Is that too high a threshold to be eligible in your view?
It's interesting because we already have dental care for low-income Ontarians. It was introduced, the Healthy Smiles program was introduced in 2016 to do exactly what it is that Alison was talking about, provide preventive care and basic primary care. It isn't tooth whitening, it isn't tooth straightening. It is just making sure that we prevent the preventable, which is cavities. In over 90% of cases, cavities are preventable, and yet people don't have access to primary care. So the question you are raising is, should everybody get this? And there is an argument to be said that everybody should get good preventive health care to minimize the costs of the system. But we also know that higher income people already pay out of pocket for these things. So I think this is a really interesting democratic debate. Without question, we need this preventive care for people that would otherwise not take it. And across Canada, that's over 6 million people that can't afford a dentist. And so this idea that the Ontario NDP have, I don't know how different it would be from what we already have that was introduced under Kathleen Wynne's Liberals. And I don't know how different it would be than what the federal NDP are offering, other than we would raise the ceiling for more people. I have to say, for me, the jury's out as to whether we want universal access to preventive, basic dental care, or whether we want richer people to pay for it more. My argument would be kind of along the line of what Ken said earlier about public transit. We should have more progressive taxation. Rich people should pay for it through their taxes, but not at point of use. It should be a public good.
Ken, your view on this Dentacare plan by the NDP?
Yeah. I'm not known in this wide world of sports as a New Democrat voter, but I really like this, and I like it for the following reason. As I understand it, they're looking at the gaps that exist, people that don't have private insurance. So the government's actually not trying to, or the NDP are not proposing, as I understand it, to crowd out private insurance, but to fill gaps in the healthcare system of people that don't have private insurance. And I think that's a really good way to think about how to, if we're going to improve healthcare, we should look at gap filling as opposed to universal treatment or just giving it to everybody. And I think there's other areas of healthcare where this might be a smart idea to go. So I'm very intrigued by this. I also think it should be done at the provincial level. So Armin, just tell the federal NDP to get out of it and let the provinces do it. This is healthcare is provincial jurisdiction. We should be delivering healthcare at the provincial level, and the Liberals and the NDP should break their silly little deal and not worry about dental care. But I like the idea of a gap filling dental care program that fills a gap for people that aren't otherwise able to get insurance.
It wouldn't be a good Canadian discussion if we didn't have a fight about which jurisdiction and level of government is responsible for. Anyway, leaving that aside. Okay, policy issue number 3. The Greens, they want to provide significant incentives for businesses investing in, for example, energy efficient and low carbon equipment, buildings, vehicle fleets, and so on. They'd put big subsidies behind making that happen. Who's going to go first? Ken, you are. What do you think of this idea?
You know, I'm part of a group called Conservatives for Clean Growth, and we've put forward been helping campaigns put forward green plans. My own preference is to have a carbon tax, to ramp up the carbon tax and to rely on that and not double it up by doing all these other things. But I acknowledge that some people would prefer to use a carbon tax, some people would prefer to use these subsidies and other things. I worry a little bit that these sort of interventionist, regulatory, and spending programs are less efficient than having a carbon tax and letting people make their own decisions. I'd be much more open to a carbon tax that rises more quickly than having government regulate and spend more money on these types of programs. But clearly we have a climate issue we need to deal with. Clearly we need to put better policy in place, and anything that moves in that direction is the right way. I just have a small preference for a market-based solution like a carbon tax, even if that means raising it a little faster.
You're never going to be leader of the Conservative Party with ideas like that. You know that, Ken.
Hey, you never know.
Okay. All right. Alison, go ahead. You go second. What do you think of this idea by the Greens to subsidize more environmentally sensible behavior?
Yeah, I don't like this idea either, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. But I think what we should be doing is making the cost of things that pollute the environment and cause environmental externalities cost more. And that will act as a subsidy for things that are sustainable. So instead of larding the Tax Act with yet another incentive or yet another credit, The fix here is to make the polluter pay. Okay, and now we talk about carbon taxes, but the carbon taxes are way too low and they're just insufficient and they attack the consumer. We need to get at those profits. Profits that are being made from unsustainable production need to be taxed away. And that's not popular either. No party wants that. I understand that. But that's the right idea. And bad tax policy is whenever you see a problem, you try to fix it by paying somebody to do the opposite. No, you should tax the problem itself.
In fairness, I guess I should say the NDP and the Liberals also have their own versions of a very similar plan, which is essentially to give subsidies and/or tax breaks to those who want to retrofit their houses, renovate, et cetera, make them more energy efficient and so on. Armine, what do you think of the idea?
I guess I'm going to piggyback on what Ken said and say that I'm all for something that both punishes the bad behavior and rewards those who wish to act, because not everybody has the pocket change to do the changes that we know need to happen. And my God, we are in a climate emergency. If we haven't figured it out yet, it's going to be coming at us pretty darn soon. So I think the idea of both taking with one hand and giving with the other makes a lot of sense at a time when we have no time to waste. Having the market fix things is fine if everybody had the money to fix things. The one thing I would say about the green plan is I was surprised it was just business incentives, because to your point, Steve, there are more households than there are businesses, and there's more that every individual household can do to change its energy consumption. However, it is businesses, and particularly big polluters, climate emission producers, that are driving the trajectory. So if you only had a certain amount of money, focusing it on businesses is a good idea. But I guess the question is, why don't we have all hands on deck right now?
Let's do another round as it relates to electric vehicles, because we know the three so-called progressive parties are offering as much as $10,000 to incentivize people to buy electric vehicles, even electric bicycles. There's incentives for those as well. The progressive conservatives have, I guess, belatedly come on board with some of that. They certainly canceled all those programs when they first came in, but they appear to be getting religion on it now. Okay, Alison, start us off on this. What do you think of these incentives?
Okay, so I'll just repeat it again. Like, if a car cost what it actually costs to produce the car in terms of its externalities for the future, then you wouldn't need to incentivize the more sustainable one, because the more sustainable one would be cheaper. So the answer here is to tax away the unsustainable profits. That's harder, and people don't like to talk about that. But it's in the production of unsustainable processes and using unsustainable, non-renewable resources, those should be much, much higher. And if you're worried about getting people to be able to afford the one that's more sustainable, that's just a different question. This question of affordability and making having people have enough to live on is just a separate question. It shouldn't be always attached to these incentivizing behaviors that we want and getting rid of the behaviors we don't want.
Ken, your view on the EVs?
Just quickly, I live in Alberta, and 70% of emissions in Alberta are industrial and 30% are retail. In Ontario, 60% are retail and 40% are industrial. So if Ontario is going to deal with climate change, they really need to get at the consumer at the retail side. So I just, to back up what Armine said, I think that's very important to understand. Ontario needs to deal with the retail side, and that's what they're trying to do here. But again, my bias would be to raise the carbon price and give people income, as opposed to patting them on the back and slapping them across the front or whatever, like using both hands. I prefer to use the incentive approach. I'm with Alison on this. And the Eco-Fiscal Commission that I was involved with a number of years ago calculated that the implicit carbon price of most of these vehicle subsidies are like $300 or $400. That's like, it's just inefficient for the government to be subsidizing these things as opposed to having a rising carbon price.
Armine, your view?
It's complicated because I don't think it is just about how we're rewarding or penalizing people if we are going to make this switch. And the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and Germany's reliance on Russian oil made it really clear to me that how we get the electricity for the electric vehicles are just as important. What is the infrastructure for fueling up these new vehicles is just as important as making people buy different things or penalizing them for what they're buying. And I don't think we're there yet. I mean, I think we keep kind of lurching towards solutions on what kind of a vehicle are you going to drive, which brings us back right to the top of this conversation, which is a buck a ride province-wide, is perhaps the most retail level, as Ken said, the most granular way of getting us to change our behaviors at a scale that could make a difference, that could actually move the needle. We're going to have to get more people to drive less, period. Whether it's an electric vehicle or a gas, I mean, obviously the world is moving towards more EVs, and we are going to be producing them, and that's all cool. But it's not the move that we think it is in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And if the goal is about reducing carbon emissions, now, how are you behaving, Madam or Mrs. Car Driver? If the goal is to reduce carbon emissions, we have to be ruthlessly focused on what we are doing to both use energy and reduce our use of energy.
It's interesting you put it that way, because I was talking to Diane Sachs on the weekend, the deputy leader of the Ontario Greens, and she said, this sounds great. And of course, her party is putting something out on that. But she says the reality is if you're just replacing all of the internal combustion cars on the highways today with electric vehicle cars, you've still got problems with sprawl, you've still got problems with traffic congestion, you've still got demands to build more highways, and therefore you're not really getting any further ahead in that respect. So she agrees with you. And while I've brought up highways, let's do that next. Issue 4 here, the Progressive Conservatives, who don't really have an election platform other than the budget they introduced at the end of April, which of course was tabled but not passed. They have allocated $25 billion for new highway construction. They say it's important to move people, goods, and as a spur to the economy. Okay, Armine, you up first this time. What do you think?
Okay, so this goes to what Allison and Ken have been saying is how are you going to pay for it? There it is. That's the budget. $25 billion. It's already baked in. We've already got the revenues to cover it. And that is the craziest way to spend $25 billion I can think of. There is one highway that they mention in the budget that truly does need building, and that's the highway to the north. And we've been talking about that for almost as long as I've been alive, this whole Ring of Fire thing. If we only got one highway done, God bless us if it's that one, because it would open up economic development from the north. However, the idea that that money is there to do pretty much anything we want is underscored by a secondary fact that is not well understood in this budget. I was comparing this budget to last year's budget, 2 pandemic year budgets. And for the year that just passed, 2021-2022, the Ontario government managed to get their projection for that year, a year ago, wrong by $9 billion worth of spending. They spent $9 billion less than they said they were going to spend on healthcare and education and other basic programs. And they received $19 billion more than they said they were going to get a year ago. That is not a rounding error, ladies and gentlemen. That is deliberate undercounting of the money they are getting and the money they are spending. And it reminds me a great deal of what happened in the run-up to the year 2000 election, where Paul Martin had cut spending so dramatically that they generated surpluses 3 years ahead of time, and they used those surpluses in the run-up to the 2000 election to out-tax cut Preston Manning and the Reform Party. I don't know whether we are building in some kind of weirdo surprise surplus business in this budget, but it's not just the $25 billion that I think is badly allocated of the money we've got. It's the money they didn't spend on healthcare, the money they didn't spend on education, and the revenues that the windfall of revenues that they didn't count on and how they're using them. I think it's a hugely problematic budget, and if that's the roadmap for the future, we're in trouble.
Allison, $25 billion for highways. What say you?
Yeah, okay. So if I have, on the one hand, $25 billion for highways, or on the other hand, all of the above, the buck a ride, the tax incentives for electric vehicles, and for, government subsidized dental care. I'll take all of the above. This is a terrible idea. If what you're trying to do is forestall our ability to address climate change, if you're trying to encourage urban sprawl, if you're trying to reward people who live very, very far away from where they work and discourage having a community, if you want to discourage using technology to build hybrid workplaces, this is the budget to do it. I can't find anything that I like in this idea at all. I understand this idea about the road to the north, and I hear what you said about that. I appreciate that idea. Maybe instead of a road, it's a rail. Maybe we need to go back to that Bucka ride question again and think about that some more. I'm not sure. But yeah, I don't like anything about this idea, this budget at all.
Ken, do you like anything about $25 billion for roads?
Well, conservative voters are people who drive to survive, and they are rural people who are in their vehicles a lot because they live in remote communities, or they're suburban people. Even if they take the train to work, they drive their kids to hockey and to ballet and to music lessons and all those kind of things. So this is a reach out to their voters, a signal that they understand their voters, and that's a political reality that they're dealing with. I would tend to echo the other sentiments of the other guests by saying, if there's an economic argument for these highways, then that makes more sense to me than a commuter argument for these highways. And if we need more goods coming into Toronto and we need highways to make sure the trucks get there on time, if we can get the Ring of Fire and all the mining activity we can get batteries for the future of electric cars, I mean, I think Armin makes a really strong argument for that. And we've been talking about it for a long time. So I would prefer to hear economic arguments for these highways than pure commuter arguments for these highways. But I think what's happening here is a political signal to the people that vote Conservative.
Yeah, the studies that have been done objectively by organizations that don't have any skin in the game say that the commuter arguments are basically baseless, that there are no reasons to do it. But as you say, there are other arguments to marshal here as well, Ken. All right, let's go on to the deficits, because all of the spending that we've talked about here, and of course these are only a tiny fraction of the promises that the different parties have made, will result in considerable expenditures of billions of dollars. So Sheldon, can we have the next graph up, please? Because we're going to look at the deficit projections in the billions of dollars going the next few years out. And we'll compare the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives, because the NDP hasn't brought out their fully costed plan yet, and neither have the Greens. The Liberals brought theirs out this morning, and for the fiscal year in which we are currently operating, 22-23, the Liberals are matching the Conservative budget number of nearly $20 billion of deficit spending. If you go to next fiscal year, the Liberals are spending a little bit more, $3 billion and change, than the Conservatives would. And if you go to the following fiscal year, the Liberals are still spending about $1.2 billion more than the Progressive Conservatives. And we don't have it on this chart, but if you go 1 year beyond that, they even up again, and they are the same numbers. So we have in the province of Ontario at the moment, and I'll go to the tax expert on this one first. That's you, Allison. We have a situation where we are bringing in red hot revenue, right? Like the revenues are going through the roof right now, but so is the spending. And the deficits are actually getting higher this year compared to last year, despite record revenues coming in. My question is this a good idea? Your view?
Yeah, so, okay. Is it terrible to have a deficit? No, if you're investing in the future. So a deficit means that you're going to pay for that tomorrow or the next day. So what are you paying for? And is this actually going to build the returns in the future? So I'm not, 100% strictly anti-deficit, but you have to think about this. But here's the problem. And I think this is the problem that you see in all political platforms. They really want to give people what they want to hear in order to elect them, but they don't want to tell people that this costs money. So I've seen the dental plan called free. It's not free, obviously. These things cost money. It's not free to have anything that the government pays for. And guess what? It's not the government paying for it. It's you and me and our children and their children. So, it's this idea that politicians have a hard time explaining if you want these things that we seem to want, then we have to spend money. And if we want to spend money, then we have to collect it from us. It's us together as a society that have to pay for these things. So if we decide we want them, we have to figure out a fair way to allocate the cost. And you don't see any talk about that at all.
Well, I was going to say, because there is no talk of that right now, Ken. I mean, this is all deficit spending, which means that future citizens are going to be paying for it. I'd like your view on the implications for now and down the road of record revenue coming in and yet deficits continuing to get larger in the face of increased government spending. What's your take?
Well, Doug Ford has the word conservative in his party name, but I'm convinced that his ideology is customer service as opposed to anything resembling conservatism. So I don't think he's motivated by these kinds of issues, number one. Number two, and at the risk of sounding more like Armeen in her writing, you know, we've spent the last 20 years being pretty fiscally responsible. We spent, the governments in Ontario have been very tight for many years. The federal government has been very tight for a number of years, and until the last number of years. But what that did is it set us up with the ability to deal with this pandemic. We ran a lot of big deficits. We were able to do that because we were fiscally responsible. So on these things, I tend to take the long view. I don't think we're out of the woods yet. On the post-pandemic recovery, what does that look like? What are our priorities? So I'm not one to say we should balance the budget immediately. I think there are some big challenges coming up. My concern is less about how big of the deficit is. Why are we running deficits? What are we spending the money on? And are we making sure that down the road we're prepared for other emergencies? What is the next emergency? It's like every 6 months some crazy thing is happening. Our energy prices go through the roof because of war in Ukraine. The pandemic happens. And I think structurally, Canada's been in a better place because of our policies of the last 20 years and got our fiscal house in order and allowed us to get through this pandemic, run huge deficits and still be what I would call affordable. And so now we've got to say, let's think long term and make sure we're prepared for the next, whatever the crisis is. But I'm not sure we're completely out of the current one. So balancing budgets are important. I'm a conservative. I prefer to do that, but I'm not so excited about that quite yet until I know that we're getting through this crazy couple of 2 years in the pandemic and what kind of weird things are going to happen to our workforce and many other things as a result of this pandemic. We should have money ready for that.
Armeen, your view.
I agree with both of your guests, and it's a pleasure to do so. Number one, nobody can balance the books quickly right now. And so the question, the chart that you put up just a few minutes ago showed a relatively speaking small difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And you know that the NDP and the Greens are not likely to balance books more rapidly. So we're seeing probably the most conservative of the parties showing that they can't balance the books immediately. The very small difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives largely focus on increased expenditures on not only a buck a ride, which is a big ticket item, but also building 1.5 million homes and reducing cap sizes of kids in classes to 20 students and hiring 10,000 new teachers. Can I just say, if you're looking forward and saying, how do you deal with the fact these are not the unknowns that Ken was pointing out, more perhaps another wave of pandemic. We don't know what the unknowns are around the corner, to channel Donald Rumsfeld, where the unknown unknowns wait to be known down the road. However, we do know that population aging is coming to a neighborhood near you. And our kids were devastated. Ontario had the longest number of days of school closure of any jurisdiction in Canada, and Canada beat the band around the world on how many kids didn't get into school. So we have got a lot of catch up to do for those kids, and they are going to be our future as the boomers retire. And we are going to need more newcomers. And since Ontario is the welcoming magnet for newcomers around the world, we need more housing. So these two things, more housing and better education for elementary and high school kids, as well as better early learning and childcare, this is looking around the corner and seeing what you know is coming at you and preparing for it. To me, that's worth a slightly higher deficit in the out years.
Gotcha. Okay, we are down to our last few minutes here, and I want to get each of you on what seems to be the political reality, regardless of jurisdiction, in the country today. And that is, You can kind of promise whatever you like and spend a lot more if you want to, as long as you don't raise the taxes on anybody making less than $200,000 a year. And probably you can tax some corporations a little more as well. And I'd like to get your view. Allison, you start us off on this. I'd like to get your view on the advisability of what appears to be a new and unbreakable rule in political life in this country.
Yeah, I think it's hard to talk about tax because for each individual, it makes a lot of sense when the government says, I'm going to put more money in your pocket. That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to have more money in my pocket. But when you put all those pockets together, that's us as a society, and there's not enough money to go around to address healthcare, to address education, and to bring us into a world in which we have climate disaster happening around us. That people have a hard time getting from their own pocket to understanding society as a whole. And politicians, I don't know if they've taught people to be selfish or they've learned that selfish messages are effective. I don't know which one it is, but that's unfortunate. We need to think about not just, is it bad for me to pay more tax? You know, of course I want to pay less tax. Just because I love tax law doesn't mean I love to pay more tax. But it's honest, right? I mean, I think we would all say that. But we also say that we have a vision for the society we want to live in. And for me, myself personally, that vision does not include people being left behind, being cast aside, and not having the basic healthcare and human rights that they need. And so that's always, that's a hard message from politicians. I get it. It's way easier to work that angle where nobody likes to pay more tax, even if they love tax law.
Ken, your view.
I'm going to disagree. I did politics in BC for a while, and I was surprised as a conservative when I got there at how popular the carbon tax was. And in part, it was popular because they raised the carbon tax and lowered other taxes, and people made the connection between the two, and they knew they needed to have higher carbon prices to deal with the climate issues, and they were happy to see their other taxes go down. So I think governments should be much more creative than we've seen them be. I think there's going to be a lot of revenue coming in from carbon pricing, industrial carbon pricing, and retail carbon pricing. And using those revenues creatively to lower other taxes can make them much more popular. And so I think governments, there is going to be some taxes that are going up, and we pretend, conservatives, some of them running now, pretend that everyone hates carbon taxes, but there's no evidence for that. Carbon tax has been going up in Canada, and people say they're angry, but it's like a few cents at the pump, and we need to do this. Everyone knows we need to do this, and that revenue can be used to lower other taxes, make that more popular, and maybe spend a few dollars, but I'd prefer to cut more taxes. I know Armene's going to say she'd prefer to spend some of it. But I think we are in an era where taxes are going to go up, and they're called carbon taxes, and it's going to generate a ton of new revenue, and we're going to have to figure out how to spend that revenue, whether that's in cutting other taxes, which is my preference, or maybe Armene wants to spend it. But I think there's lots of new revenues coming in.
Let's give the last word to Armene, and she can tell us what she wants to do with it.
I couldn't agree more with Ken. Actually, taxes are going up, and they are carbon taxes, and we have all bought into the need for that, and that includes low-income people. The second point I want to make is that not only in the wake, or during and in the wake of this pandemic, hopefully we're in the wake of it, but since the global financial crisis, corporate concentration has galloped by leaps and bounds, as has the concentration of wealth, and we have not taxed that. We have not taxed the people that have made out like bandits during this pandemic. Do you know, when I was looking at the last federal budget, I compared the affordability challenge to what happened in the wake of the first oil price shock in 1974 and what happened in the wake of the Second World War, when governments were dealing with labor shortages, supply shortages, everything shortages back then, and that was causing inflation to spike. We go through certain periods in our lives. This is not unprecedented, but this is the only period I can see historically where we did not tax those that made out like bandits. So there is room to tax more at the top, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. That's what the IMF and the World Bank have been talking about since 2010. More inclusive growth means taking from those at the top, spending on those at the bottom, because those at the bottom actually boost the economy from the bottom up. So if you give them better jobs, you give them reasons to be paid better, and give them better jobs through public services that literally put money in your pocket, they will pay more in revenues. So it's not the tax rate so much as how much money are you making and how much are you sharing in your through your revenues. And that's where I think it's absolutely correct not to tax people at the bottom more, other than through carbon taxes, and to tax people at the top more, so that we can actually build better public infrastructure for everybody, and that will lift the whole system up.
It is always a joy to have three such smart guests on our program as you three. Ken Bozenkool, Armin Yalnizyan, Alison Christians, thanks so much, and be well out there, you three.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
It was a delight. Thank you.
A lot of fun.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.